The Canon EOS 6D Mark II, the long-awaited successor to the original 6D, the diet soda of full-frame DSLRs. Announced in June of 2017. Hold up, we know this camera came out a year ago, and yes, this review is late. We actually got to test a pre-production 6D Mark II in Yellowstone prior to the official announcement last year, and we gave it a full hands-on write-up at that time. However, because of reasons, we weren't able to get a final production version of the camera in hand until now, hence this rather tardy review. But there is actually still a good reason to talk about the 6D Mark II this long into its life. Sony, for example, just announced the A7 III not too long ago, which basically rewrote the book on what an entry-level full-frame camera should be. And as for the 6D Mark II itself, you can now pick it up for just $1,600, so $400 off the launch price. And Canon is throwing in the vertical battery grip for free, so it's not too shabby. But is it enough to actually consider buying this camera? Let's take a look. The 6D Mark II arrived to a somewhat reserved response from the press. Not so much because it was bad necessarily, but because it simply didn't do enough good. On paper, while many of the specs looked impressive compared to the original 6D, like the new 45-point autofocus system, dual pixel autofocus in live view, and faster 6.5 frames per second continuous shooting, there was nothing that was really new or unique compared to other Canon cameras. We had seen all of this tech before. The 6D came out way back in 2012, so the 6D Mark II arrived some 4.5 years after it, and it merely caught up to the rest of Canon's product range. And that's just not good enough if you want this thing to be able to last another 4.5 years. So there is one component that's entirely new, and that's the 26 megapixel full-frame sensor. But as you've probably heard already from other reviewers, it doesn't exactly have the best reputation. A lot of people are talking about how the dynamic range has not improved at all and is in fact worse than a 4-year-old Nikon D750, and worse even than some of Canon's own APS-C cameras, so cameras using a smaller sensor like the EOS 80D. Is Canon embarrassed because of this? Maybe. Is it a reason to not buy the camera though? Well, that depends. Here's the thing. If you don't often work in high contrast scenes, then the lack of dynamic range may not be an issue for you. In less extreme situations, we still found the raw files to be flexible enough to create some pleasing results, but push things too far and yeah, you're going to run into noise. But many people may actually benefit more from the 6D Mark II's pretty impressive high ISO capability. It performs much closer to the competition as you ramp up the ISO. So if you commonly shoot in low light, like interior wedding receptions, this might not be a bad camera. Perhaps we're kinder than most in our appraisal of the 6D Mark II's image quality, but there is a catch here. Even where it's strong, it's merely keeping pace with the competition. But where it's weak, it definitely falls behind. It offers some usability improvements over the Nikon D750 in the form of dual pixel autofocus and a fully articulating touch-enabled screen, but that's really it. While dual pixel autofocus would seem to make a lot of sense for video, the video mode on this camera is essentially just equal to that on, again, the much older Nikon D750. It's 1080p at up to 60 frames per second, without any of the pro-level functions you'll find on the likes of Sony's cameras or even some of Canon's other DSLRs. The 6D Mark II doesn't even have a headphone jack. So video is definitely an afterthought here, and the video quality itself is, well, it's below par, even for a 1080p camera. Sure, it's easy to just say that this camera doesn't target video shooters, but it's still annoying that Canon continues to drag its feet when it comes to implementing high-end video features across its product line. But again, the 6D Mark II is not a bad camera. It's really well made, the weather sealing is great, and it has a 1200 shot battery life. It's also super responsive, and both the viewfinder and live view autofocus systems are leagues ahead of the original 6D. And while, yeah, the dynamic range might be an issue for you, the high ISO performance is admirable. But there's just nothing about this camera that is unique or special. Still, for Canon shooters, especially those looking to upgrade to their first full-frame body, the 6D Mark II is a great buy right now at $1,600 with the vertical battery grip included. Unfortunately for Canon, both the Nikon D750 and the Sony a7 II can also be picked up with their respective battery grips for just $1,500. So if you're not a Canon shooter, you have some really compelling alternatives, and there's just no strong argument that's going to sway you in the direction of the 6D Mark II. And if you have an extra $500 to burn, well, then the newer Sony a7 III is basically going to put you into a different league of camera. But for Canon shooters, the 6D Mark II does still bring a lot of value to the table for its current price, and so long as you know the limitations going into it, you'll be happy with it. For more on the 6D Mark II, make sure you head to digitaltrends.com to read our full review.